Hello, Jessica Curry. Can you?
I got so confused about when to press my button. Hello.
Right. Hello. So first things first, welcome to the Craft of Composition, where the Ivors is celebrating excellence in songwriting and composition. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Jessica Curry to Zoom chat. My name's Jenny Nelson. I am the Programme Manager of Scala Radio, and here is a quick introduction about the wonderful Jessica Curry. BAFTA winning composer of Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Other credits include Dear Esther, So Let Us Melt, and most recently with Jim Fowler, Little Orpheus. She can also hold a radio presenter and concert host to her name. She has composed for choirs. She was a composer in residence with the London Oriana Choir in 2018, co-founder of games company The Chinese Room, winner of Outstanding Contribution Award. I've written this all down at Women in Games 2018, and also one of the most positive and upbeat and brilliant people I have ever had the pleasure of calling a friend. And if after this you have a few 5 minutes and you want to be entertained, then do watch her BAFTA Games acceptance speech, because it is absolutely inspired. So what we're going to do is have a quick, well, I say quick, you and I are going to have a chat for about 45 minutes. And if you've got any questions, anyone participating who has any questions that they'd like to ask, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions whenever you have a question. And you and I, Jess, if it's all right with you, I'd quite like to start with your training and then maybe go into your process, your composition process, and to talk about your, like, the end product, the music, and why you think it's touched so many people. So if we start with training, you studied English literature, and what do you think that training has brought to your work as a composer?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I studied English partly because I didn't realise that you could be a composer for a job. You know, I did music GCSE and A-level, but all the composers were dead white men. And that for me was like, you know, other people do that. You probably have to be dead. It helps. And so always loved words and text. But I don't come from a musical family. So again, it wasn't like this is what you can do. But my mum was a writer. She hadn't been to university. She'd left school at 15, but imbued me with a love of words. So I studied English literature, like you said, and it's something that has been absolutely fundamental to my whole career. I love the melding of music and words, and that always feeds into pretty much all of my music projects, whether that be for games or theatre or installations. Everything that I do, I want to tell stories, and I think there's something really special about stories that you can tell with music and text.
And so with the words side of things, when you're working, you know, when you're collaborating with someone, or when you're getting a brief from someone, does it, even if they're the person giving the brief isn't from a musical background, do you find that you're able to kind of get to the nubbin of what they're looking for? Yeah,
and I think it's a really good question, because a lot of the time, one of the problems that you face as a media composer is how do you talk to a non-musical person? And your nightmare is if they just say, well, can you make it sound like John Williams, but you know, the budget's £10,000 and you've got 3 weeks. And they often start with that because they feel maybe a little bit insecure about, they don't know how to speak to you. So actually, if you just go back to how do you want this game to make you feel? How should the music be helping that? Often it's a really good way, it's a very evocative and emotive way of getting into the nitty-gritty, like you say, of a project.
And with regards to your influences, so you and I worked on a radio show a few years ago about, and one of the episodes was your influences, and I went and looked back over the running order of that in preparation for this, and it was such a great listen, because there were some games, you know, there was Absolute by Austin Wintory, there was Mass Effect 3 for Clint Mansell, but there was quite a bit of Peter Greenaway films, so the music of Peter Greenaway films, and the show started with Coventry Carol. So I was just wondering if you could kind of just share with us what it was in particular about the Coventry Carol and Peter Greenaway films that you feel have been so inspiring to you.
I mean, it's just a big dose of melancholy, isn't it? I was an extremely strange and morbid child. I was obsessed with the threat of nuclear war. And I remember the Coventry Carol being one of the first pieces of music that really touched my heart. And I think if you speak to most composers, they'll have that moment where they go, this transcends everything else that I've heard before and just strikes me so deeply. And I think everything on that playlist that we did, there is a sort of commonality of emotion that runs through. And I think it's about, I don't call myself a spiritual person, but a kind of spirituality within music. I love Hildegard von Bingen. And I think Peter Greenaway has that ability to kind of coalesce all my interests, really, sort of what it means to be human, what makes us, what are the complex things about being human, and death and grief and love and messiness and bodily functions and beauty and grand guignol and expansiveness and art, and they're all quite big, meaty themes. And I think, again, Greenaway and Nyman's collaboration. I mean, I come from a small town in Lancashire. Like I say, none of my, I was the first person to go to university. I'd had quite not a sheltered upbringing, I had a very liberal upbringing, but in terms of arts and what was available to me, it was pre-internet as well. It was kind of limited in some ways. And I remember someone took me to see Prospero's books at the Curzon in London in my, I think, first year of university. And it just blew my mind. It was just, I was like panting coming out of the cinema going, this exists. I didn't know about this. And again, it's something about that. For me, their relationship was about, I'd only ever heard film music that kind of was beautiful, but that was always serving the picture. It does its job very nicely and it behaves itself and it does what it's told and it stays in its place. And Nyman just went absolutely sod that, threw it out of the window and put the music here, in your face, so viscerally. And there was something so challenging and exciting and just life affirming about that. And then I I left university, was totally unemployable. It turns out that, studying Petrarchan sonnets and Chaucer doesn't really get you anywhere in the job market. Who knew? Got rejected by loads of places, Dunkin' Donuts, ended up just not knowing what I wanted to do, still not considering music. And my lovely late stepdad put an application for the National Film and Television School in front of me and said, darling, this is what you should be doing. Do music and do it for film. You love film music, you're obsessed by it, go and do it. So I'd, got this Greenaway Nyman excited collaboration in my head of this is how all directors will want to work. Turns out that's not so true, that they kind of wanted that much more traditional model, but it's something that has definitely stayed with me throughout my career, that music can be subversive actually within media.
And so going back to games composition for games, I'm sorry if this is like a really basic question, but I mean, how does it differ from composing for film and television? If you were to compare composing for the screen, what makes games composition so unique?
Such a good question, because they're tied, they're linked, but they're also diametrically so opposed in that, I was taught at film school that you can focus on these beautiful, small minutiae of moments that if someone just slowly turns their head, the music can just follow that moment. And it's really satisfying to score for. And it's that linear journey where the film doesn't change, doesn't matter how many times you watch it, it has the same beginning, middle and end. Obviously, games are an interactive, dynamic medium and the music has to follow suit. So you then get into a whole world of pain, basically. and gin, as it turns out with me. It's so technically complicated. So my first game was Dear Esther, made by husband Dan. And he said, look, can you just put some music on this? And he wasn't making games professionally. He was doing a PhD. So it wasn't a big deal. And I didn't know how game music worked. So I essentially, for Dear Esther, wrote a film score for a game. So the music isn't interactive in any way. And if you play Dear Esther 100 times, the music will trigger in the same place in the same way. So at that point, I had no idea what the difference was between film music and game music. I just thought I just stick a film score into a game. Turns out it doesn't work like that. Interestingly though, which we can maybe come back to, it was seen as incredibly successful and satisfying without any interactivity. So that's maybe something to touch on about how important that is or not. But with game music, you have to think in a completely different way, in that you can't necessarily have those moments like you get as a film composer. So you have to be really creative in the way that you're able to support the player's journey. And then you have to add on the complexity that you're not just supporting the player's journey, but you're guiding them through their experience. You're often working with designers from the games companies to say, we've got 3 paths. We kind of really want them to go down the left one. It's called visual signposting. And they will either have maybe a glowing icon, or the path will look more interesting that way. There'll also be an expectation that you'll be able to support that choice through music, and that could growing or shrinking dynamically. So that's something you've got to think about. You've also, on top of that, got to be able to compose in chunks or blocks. And they can expand and contract horizontally, but you're really glad you asked this question now, Jenny, horizontally or vertically. So if you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 3 should theoretically be able to flow into 1, 2 into 5, and every permutation has to work. And then when you're expanding in this direction, you can have, so when you go into the recording studio, you will be recording separate instruments, or so you're doing the brass, then the winds, then maybe piano, harp, singers, choir, whatever, separately. So you then have the ability to say, well, at this point, the player isn't doing very much, so we'll just have the piano layer with voice. But then if they're walking towards something and something interesting happens, you can expand that. So maybe number 6 is more interesting or exciting musically, so you'll be able to transition into that. But you'll also be able to expand out saying, well, I want to go to the string section now. I really want some warmth and some pads. So it's just this big maelstrom of moving parts, which you simply don't have with linear music for film or television. So it is very complex. And there are technical constraints then about how to get the music into the game, which if you're at the beginning of your career, you will be expected to be able to do. I mean, I have the luxury now of having nice people. I go, take my music and do something wonderful with it. It's not quite as simple as that, actually, because I do like, I'm very, I like to be involved in knowing how the music's going to be used, but I hope I've sort of explained that it is kind of a different thing, really.
Yeah, so I suppose, because, I mean, thinking of film and telly, I imagine the composer is given a script, and they read through the script, and then they kind of, ideas hopefully start forming from there. So do you receive a scene by scene breakdown, and then is that initial, is just sort of speaking with the designers about what they're expecting on a scene by scene level, and then, okay, that's my first question. And then the second add-on to that is that by now, have you almost got like a sort of coterie in your mind of like instruments that provide more like a certain instrument that will make that person take the left path if they have to? You know what I mean? So
first question, well, I've already forgotten the first question because I remembered the second one. What was the first part of the question?
So if so for film and TV composers, they would receive the script.
So that is kind of how long is a piece of string, because I think video game companies work so differently depending on scale of the project, size of the project, and timescales. And if you're working on an indie project, I like to be involved very early in a project. So I like to get everything, but I don't do lots of projects at the same time. So some of my composer friends just like, I kind of want to be involved when the game's nearly finished, and then they'll get a build of the game, they'll be playing it. And that's something else that you need the sort of technical ability to be able to do, to navigate your own way around some quite complex spaces sometimes. But I'm just like, throw everything at me. So I want concept, I want storyboards, I want to be talking to the sound designer, listening to what they're doing. And often the way Dan and I have worked is that I will write some music first. He'll just say, okay, this is a basic setting. Can you write some music for the team to work to? And then it becomes a sort of interactive experience in itself where we're bouncing things backwards and forwards. And I think the composer, the scores that are very loved, I don't think it's an accident that most of those composers were on those projects for years rather than weeks or even months, that they completely embedded themselves in the project. Something like Journey with Austin Wintory, I'm sure a lot of people listening will know his work. You know, he was on that game, like I was on Rapture for 3 years, he was on Journey for 3 years. We both knew those worlds and those characters inside out. And I think, like with any project that you're doing artistically, it kind of shows. But I think on a sort of practical level, you have to be led by the development team really, and the creative director in the way they like to work. But I think it's also interesting to say, can I have a look at that? You know, if it's no problem, can you send me the storyboards from an early point, just so you can start to be immersed in that world? And in terms of the second question, which I have remembered, and I want to prize at the end, I don't think that I'm as intellectual as that when I'm composing. I think maybe a lot of it is innate, but actually, I think most form of music making or creativity in general is quite a selfish act. And I think if you're always going, what is the audience or what is the player thinking at this specific point, you do have to do it up to a certain extent, but past that, you're losing actually what you want to say. So it's kind of a fine balance as a games composer, by going emotionally, this is what I feel I have to give, whilst also thinking about the technical or practical constraints. So I wouldn't say that I've got specific tricks, because I think every game you work on is so different that you just have to follow your gut. And it's something that is coming with experience with me, that every game I work on, I learn more about how to write for games. And I look back at Dear Esther and I kind of laugh. I kind of go, I can't believe I did it really without knowing anything. And then Little Orpheus, the last game, I kind of think, no, I'm only just starting now to feel like I can call myself a video game composer.
Wow. Okay. And I mean, you mentioned like the sort of, you know, whilst you're working on the game, then you're playing parts of it and, you know, actually experiencing it. Do you think a games composer needs to be a gamer in order to be an effective games composer?
So when I did Dear Esther, I hadn't played computer games since I was a kid. Dan, husband, he's like a stick of rock. He's gamer through and through. Like it's his reason for living. He loves all form of creativity and art forms, but he's passionate about games and he's so knowledgeable. And his PhD is on games. He has a PhD in first-person shooters, which he always says is the least useful PhD known to mankind. He's always terrified that someone on a plane will say, is there a doctor? And he'll say, yes, but I can only get you through the second level of doom. I can't save him. And I, at the time, didn't think that video games had anything for me. I just thought, the kind of traditional, quite ignorant view of they're all violent, they're all for boys, they're all misogynistic. And that is an element of the industry. But once I started working on them and Dear Esther became incredibly successful very quickly. So we were going to all kinds of festivals and conferences. And I was like, oh, there's this whole world out there of indie games that I knew nothing about, people exploring the things that I'm interested in about love and relationships and, you know, deep stories and art games. So I think as soon as I became aware of that, it did make me a better composer for games. So it wouldn't be my preferred art form or choice of entertainment, partly because I'm on the screen all day, most of the days, and I then don't want to be on another screen. I don't really want to watch TV at night either. I'd rather read a book or go for a walk or, you know, just be my beautiful self, contemplating the world. Some of the video game composers I know are obsessed with games and the way they work and the mechanics, and they have a total kind of encyclopedic knowledge. And I'm not like that, and I've still done okay. So I don't know the answer. I think there's room for both. It helps to be passionate about, you know, the job that you do, I think. But I wouldn't say I'm a games composer. Every project I do, does the story interest me?
That's what I was going to, I mean, that's from conversations I've had with you, it does seem that the story is the key thing. And that's why it makes sense that you want to be involved from the beginning, to get immersed in this, and I imagine you probably are asking, you know, why does the character do that? Or what are we looking for within the character? What is the story the music needs to tell about characters and about the situations? I mean, going on to Rapture, do you think, can you recall what the initial conversations were about that, about what sort of music the team were looking for that story?
Rapture's set in the 80s, and I originally went down a sort of Vangelis, really synthy, almost proggy vibe. And everyone just loved the music, like Sony loved it. And we were like, yeah, this is so cool, man. And I was getting really like, you know, just this is going to be amazing. And then we put it into the game and everyone was like, this is a horrible disaster. This is so bad. And it was a really interesting case study in going, this can be really great, fun music, but it can be so wrong for a project. And I was kind of struggling to find the tonal world for Rapture. And at the time I was singing in a choir, and Aileen Manahan Thomas, who's a very famous soprano, was the soloist that night. And she started singing and I was like, okay, that's it. Boom, I've written the music. And I've never had anything really like it before or since, where I've just gone, it was like a house of cards. As soon as that voice came, I was like, that's the voice of Rapture. And it was just a brilliant filmic moment, actually, because normally it's just a lot of slog and it's fun, but it's hours. But this was just like, literally, I was then dreaming the music and then getting up and writing the next morning. She unlocked something so beautiful about what I wanted to say about the world of Rapture, which was that it was very much a game about, it's really about grief, I think. And Dan and I just lost my very beloved stepdad at the time. And he was such a positive person. And I wanted to write something that was about, I think it's quite timely again at the moment. I mean, Rapture's about a pandemic, so it really is very timely, but it was about how short life is and how we need to make the best of those human connections and explore the best of people in a way. And there was something about Aileen's voice that was so pure. And actually, she's such a lovely person. You know, I think I must have appeared completely insane. I went up to the end, I was like, I'm a composer. I love you. I'm going to write a games score centered around your voice.
Did you wrote it for her voice specifically?
Yeah, so that really was, you know, by the end of the concert, I mean, she was like, okay. take 5 steps back, crazy lady. And I was like, I'll be in touch with your agent. She was like, okay. I think she just thought, just some random crazy lady. But then, a year later, I was like, hey, I'm back. I've written this music for you. And it's really interesting that Dan is working on the next Chinese Room unannounced game at the moment. And I've just had the same experience with a singer. And I've been really, again, I think there's a lot of struggle for me at the beginning of the group. Most people, I think, would say that's true for them as well. There's a lot of, I don't want to do this. I can't do this. I'm a terrible composer. I should just give up. I'll never be able to do it. It's too hard. Angst, very self-indulgent, and then something breaks, something unlocks. And it was really exciting this week to go, that's the person for the next one. Brilliant. And it's interesting, I think, that it's voice.
I mean, it's kind of, I suppose, the courage or the strength of your convictions, but, how do you cope with, or have you had the situation where the studio's kind of gone, that's not really what we're looking for, actually? Like, do you ever wonder what would they have said had you gone, I've got it, it's Aileen Monahan Thomas, it's going to be focused around her amazing voice, and they'd all gone, no. I mean, how do you cope with that?
Such a good question. So one of the things looking back that I think I loved about Greenaway and Nyman's collaboration was this ideal that you would have this one person that you could work with and that would understand you and inspire you. And as the years went on, they just, you know each other better and better, and you just find deeper connections creatively. And actually, I mean, they fell out so badly. It's not really there. But with Husband Dan, I think that's very much what we have. And the interesting thing now is that if I play him something early on, he doesn't have to say anything. He can crush me with a look, Jenny. He can end me. I can just see, it's just like, no. He's like the emperor, no. But he's always right, which is really annoying.
Oh!
I know. Curse him. And it's what I would encourage in terms of if people want to get into the industry, is finding those people whose creative voices resonate with them, because it is a really hard industry on lots of levels. But if you can find those people that you artistically connect with, I will take it from those people I respect. It really hurts. I did a project for the Royal Shakespeare Company last year. And I was really pleased with the first thing I'd written for them, but they came back with feedback saying this isn't really what we want. But it was so precise and kind and thoughtful, the feedback, that I kind of was like, it was almost like a Jedi mind trick where I went, this isn't good enough, I'll do it again. I didn't really mind. And I did it again and it was better. So I think for me, it's about, I don't like being told by arseholes when I don't trust or respect them. I'm just like, actually, I don't take that very well. But I think I'm fortunate now to be at the stage of my career where I can pick and choose who I work with. And you can pick people that have interesting things to say and want to get the best out of you as a media composer, that they don't have any investment in making you look stupid or belittling you or saying something's rubbish for the sake of it, that everyone is working towards a vision of excellence. And then it's exciting to iterate and change things and move on rather than demoralizing.
Yeah, and I imagine if the feedback is constructed for the purpose of the project, for the good of the project, instead of what might feel like a sort of personal, I don't like the way you did that slide.
Yeah, I mean, it always does feel personal. Don't make no mistake, it burns. If you have invested something emotionally, like I have colleagues where they push a lot of music out and it's a job, they enjoy it, but it's not that wrenching of the heart. And they see it as a great way to make a living. And that is, I'm not I say I'm not knocking that. I'm hugely judgmental of them. No, I'm not. I am. But it's just, I don't know. I take music really seriously. I kind of think if you're not doing it for that, why are you doing it? Because when it works, it's the best buzz and the best feeling in the world. But I think I'm also, sorry, go on, Jenny.
Sorry, no, you go.
No, I'm rambling, carry on.
I was going to say, so will Dan with the eyes that kill, will he give a look that's like, I think you could do better? Or will he actually say like, oh, I was imagining more trumpets, for example?
Trumpeters, Jessie.
Yeah.
No, what he gets, and I hear, since he's been at home, since lockdown, I can literally hear him. He is really good at letting people be expert in the things they know about. And I think that's the best creative directors in any industry go, I've hired you because I trust you and I like you and I think you're great at your job. So he would never say to me, could you make it more like this or less like that? We'd have probably a conversation about again, going back to the emotional intent, what's the music's role here and what function is it trying to fulfill? But he'll be very non-prescriptive about that. And interestingly, when we first started working together, he didn't tell me about Dear Esther. He said, I want it to be your interpretation. I've written this story and now I trust you to he passes the baton on. And I hear him do that all the time with code, with art, with design, with all the team, just going, I trust you and we'll sort of shape this nebulously together. And it's harder. It drives sometimes, I think, his producers a bit mad because it is messier in a way to forge something through trust rather than the whip. But I think it yields more interesting, more heartfelt results.
Yeah. And I suppose this is maybe a good time to talk about your collaboration with Jim Fowler. And I imagine there's a lot of trust there. I mean, you've worked with him on various projects. He was the orchestrator for Rapture and then co-composers of Little Orpheus. How did that come about with you two being the co-composers, and how did that change your process of composing a score?
Yeah, very much so, actually. It's been a really interesting process. So Jim and I were put together into an arranged marriage in, I think, 2015 by Sony, by great uncle Sony. And he said, he's going to be your orchestrator. And I was like, I don't need an orchestrator. I orchestrate my own projects. And was a bit like, I don't really understand why he's here, and then just completely understood about 3 seconds after meeting him. He brought so much to that project. One of the things he taught me early doors, which isn't spoken about enough, I think, in terms of the skills you need as a games composer, is up until that point, I just kept everything in my head. I'm a very organized person, but I'm not a spreadsheet person. So I was like, well, I can just keep every cue in my head or on a Word document and kind of work it out from there. And I'll write all this music. And very early on, Jim said, Rapture's a massive game. You're going to literally lose your mind unless you start getting some really gnarly spreadsheets. And he is the king of, he understands truly deeply in a way that I don't actually, the technical constraints. Sony is a tech company essentially. They make games, but he understands the hardware at such a deep level. And it was really useful having a sounding board, having that, being taught that level of organization that you need as a games, how to structure your information as much as organizational skills. And also, I'm not classically trained. I taught myself. And I think it leads to wonderful, happy, emotional accidents. But I sometimes think what Jim can bring is a kind of fairy dust of, he's obsessed with orchestration. Bless him. I do tease him quite a lot about this because he'll go, I've got a new book, like on Zoom or Skype. I'm like, he just eats, breathes, sleeps instruments and what they can do. So I, for Rapture would write something really, it's my music. But then he would just go, well, how about just putting this over here? And the fairy dust comes, and it's a wonderful skill. I think a good orchestrator can enhance most composers' work. And it was incredibly collaborative and enjoyable. So when Little Orpheus came up, I thought, well, let's take this the next step and co-compose rather than have Jim orchestrate. And it was difficult at first for me because I was very shy about it. Because Jim would sit down at the piano and go, how about this? You know, and that sort of really like, I just think we'll do this. And I'd be like, ding, 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 because I was just so shy at sharing my ideas, because historically I've been so private in my compositional process. It's so deeply personal and quite painful. So to expose that was really, really challenging at the beginning. And then I think it just became, by doing it really together, that it became easier. And I felt, it was weird because I trust Jim and I consider him to be a friend. It wasn't anything personal. It was just that simple act of showing your heart in a way at the very early process before it's polished and good. And it's about ideas, and like, would he laugh? Which he never would, you know what I mean? But it was such a deep insecurity. And I think that was good for me to push past that creatively and go, no, we will make something together. And I think it, as a score, highlights both of our strengths, which is it's stunningly orchestrated. It's just so playful and joyous music. And it has the Jessica Curry patented bleeding heart you know, sound in it as well. So it's a really nice combination, and I would definitely collaborate again. I think it was less lonely in a way. You know, it can be very solitary being a composer, so that was nice as well. Just we chatted every day, and you know, it was nice.
So I suppose leading from that, what would you say advice to people who have been either arranged marriage put together or are trying out musical collaborations for the first time? What would your advice be to them?
Oh, such a good question. Yeah, I think it's all about trust, isn't it? I know it sounds like a really hippie answer, but I think if you're going to create something real, you have to be open. And what I have learned in my career is that I have I've sort of given a lot to people who can take a lot, actually. And so it's that difficult combination of being trusting, but also I'm just like, I love you as soon as I meet you. Hi, I'm Jess, you know, I've bought you some socks and I've got you this and I've made some flapjack for you. And I think sometimes probably not the best way to be, but also it's how you create special things. So I think there is no one size fits all advice. I think the advice I give to composers musically is be yourself. You know, I get sent probably a couple of hundred pieces of music a month from composers starting out saying, will you listen? And I always try and listen because you know, it's helpful, I think. But a lot of it sounds like Hans Zimmer, and I kind of write back and say, listen, no one is going to out-Zimmer the Zimmer. He is the Zimmer man. He's King Zimmer. He's Lord of the Zimmers. You're not going to... He has a stable of 600 young men in a darkened space, Zimmering. Just let it go and find out what it is you want to say. And what I wish I'd learned earlier about my own music, and I'm still trying to learn it, is to be less apologetic. I'm always saying, well, I'm not classically trained and I don't really know what I'm doing, and other people know what I'm doing better than I do. But then my son came down this morning and he said, you know, you've got loads of Spotify listeners, Mum. And I was like, he doesn't talk like that. He's got a normal voice, but I was trying to be a teenager, and I was like, oh right. And he said, oh yeah. And he said, you know, you've got 250,000 listeners a month. And I was like, that's a lot of people, and it's not the most amount of people, but for me, the thought when I started out that 250,000 people every month would choose to listen to the music that I've written it still blows my mind. And so my advice to myself and others is just to try and trust yourself and trust that I'm never going to be the best orchestrator. I'm never going to write extremely complex music, but I write music that people really want to listen to and love, and that's okay. And if you're always comparing yourself, you just trip over yourself constantly, and it's exhausting and it's a waste of time. And I've wasted a lot of time doubting myself over the years. And yeah, I feel sad about that in a way.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to the Q&As in just a moment, so do please keep posting in your questions. But I have just a few more for you, Jess. And we touched on this a bit earlier with regards to whether or not composers need to be gamers in order to compose for games. And you mentioned interactivity and that element, considering that Dear Esther had been very much a kind of, it would be the same, piece however you played the game. How important do you think at the moment, how important is interactivity for music as a composer?
If you want to get into a fight with a video game composer, this is the question to ask them in a group, because it'll end up with a massive fun fight. So if you talk to most composers, they'll have a completely different answer. And I think mine is still seen as somewhat controversial, which is, I go back to Dear Esther with zero interactivity. And it's a really beloved score. And that partly is to do with the kind of game didn't have those constraints of the music needing to be lots of things to different people doing lots of stuff. So you take that out of the mix, but actually at its heart, it was music that touched people. So I would say there are some composers out there who go, it absolutely has to be these beautifully tailored, extremely technical dynamic systems. And I'm always a bit like, really? So I think probably a happy medium is, I think sometimes the player doesn't care. They just know whether it works. That's with art in general. You kind of just instinctively know whether it's done well and it's working well. So you can have every bell and whistle and technical wizardry in the sky, but actually, if the music's bland, so what? So for me, it has to be about the emotional heart of the score, and that's the joy of composing. And the technical stuff, it's all gravy.
And Dear Esther, when you took it live with the live shows, did you what sort of reactions when you spoke to people who'd been in the audience? Did anything kind of particularly touch you with knowing how your music has affected people that you spoke to?
One of the amazing things was that as a media composer, you don't get any direct feedback on whether people like your music. They'll write to you, after the game's out. You get lovely emails and letters and fan mail, which is amazing, but you don't get that, or are they going to clap at the end? So you don't have the nerves and you don't have the massive elation. So Dear Esther started out at the Barbican, and it was packed audience, and we were just like, oh my God, this is absolutely terrifying. Why are we doing this? And liveness in itself brings all kinds of potential pitfalls. And we had 2 PCs running in case the game fell over. And it was so technically complicated to run that show. So we were just absolute bag of nerves. And then it finished and nobody clapped. And we were like, oh my God, this is awful. And there was this huge pause. And then literally about a minute later, it was the longest minute of my life, people started clapping and cheering, but it was so immersive. It's such a stunningly beautiful game, artwork by Rob Briscoe, who's just incredible. And it was lovely to feel that sense of direct feedback from an audience. So it's completely different. And I think that's only industry-wise going to keep getting stronger. Live performances and various ways of presenting video game music live is just going to keep going from strength to strength because there's such a hunger for it, as you know. So I think that's something that I would love to do more of. I mean, people ask for Rapture live constantly, but it's really expensive and very time consuming. Like Esther probably took 6 months technically to put together, me and Dan. So it was a huge investment, but I would love to see it happen. I'd love to see So Let Us Melt happen live with everyone with their VR headsets on.
I would love that. That is my favourite of your scores, so let us know.
Oh, thank you. It's my favourite too.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it is. It's the thing I'm proudest of writing.
I'm going to scroll through some of the questions, and as I scroll, I am going to start off by asking a question that Lucy Holland, who I work with at Scala Radio, she presents our weekly games music show. She sent in a little earlier because she's a huge fan of yours, as am I, and it was with regards to your... Oh, I'm going to go for this one. She sent me a few. How do you keep exploring and developing your sound?
That for me is about being sensitive to the project, and goes back to what we were talking about earlier, I think, of I don't care whether someone asks me to do an installation or an opera or whether it's a game, it's whether the crux of the story is interesting. And I think if you're inspired by the project that you take on, it will take on its own sound world. I think you can plan till the cows come home and go, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Actually, when you sit down on that first day, it will start writing itself and it will develop itself instrumentally, texturally. I'm sure, again, if you ask 100 composers, they give you 100 different answers. But I think for me, I write so viscerally. It's such an emotional response to whatever I'm working on. So yeah, I wouldn't say I have a development. The next project I would like to do this, and the next project I'd be interested in exploring that. Someone will write to me, like the Royal Shakespeare Company wrote and said, we've got this project with Magic Leap. It's augmented reality. It's obviously Shakespeare. And I was like, I am so there. And that then dictated the music that was right for that project. So if you see what I mean, it's the project that is almost leading you on to the next thing musically rather than the other way around.
Thank you. So this question, the first one I'm going to ask comes from Chris Darby, and it's partly because I would like to know the answer to the earlier proggy version of the Rapture music, this sort of Vangelis style music that you mentioned earlier. Is that available to listen to?
I think it's on SoundCloud somewhere, but Sony may have taken it off because they don't like it when I put things up. So they're always like, take it down. So it used to be up there. Whether it is anymore, I don't know. You'd have to do a little hunting. I think it's called something like 80s Rapture Test. That's the other thing. Okay. Video game composer, learn your naming structures and conventions properly, rather than 80s Rapture Test 00000 underscore 1. Which I always end up with. So maybe.
Okay, and there's one.
You may be sued by a large corporation for that.
Oh, well. And Grace would like to know, how would you advise practicing composing for games if you're not currently working for a game company as a video game composer? Kind of what skills can people keep honing in order to,
So really, really good question. Learn WWise, which is software for putting your music into, making it interactive. If you're starting out, being able to implement your music yourself will just get you 10 rungs up the ladder straight away without them having to employ somebody else to do it. Learn the technical constraints. I think you can get a free demo of Wise at the moment. The mod community is also really good. That's how Dear Esther started. Dan released it as a mod on ModDB, where you kind of use someone else's engine and make a small game out of someone else's sort of technical parts. So that community is really helpful. So I think, as well as practicing writing music, if you can get those technical skills, you really will be pushing yourself forwards. And I know it's really hard in the time of pandemic, but just making connections as well, because it's all very well doing things theoretically, but if you meet someone who's making a small game and just starting out and you work on it, you'll be learning together, which is essentially what Dan and I did. There were 3 of us on Dear Esther, and now, the Chinese room is really shiny and successful. We started out 3 people in a room together, so there's no substitution for just getting your hands dirty and doing it. People send me things that they've rescored quite a lot, which I feel a bit ambivalent towards. Like, it's good to go, can you write music? But it's not very helpful in terms of it's kind of film music, essentially, that they're sending you. So yeah, get your hands dirty if you can.
Get your hands dirty. I like that. Now this is from Alex Jones, and it's regarding, recommend one single composer we should all listen to that we might not have heard before. And I'm going to add on a games composer and then another composer. So,
so I think, trying to think of who won't be known is really interesting. I think someone who's been really inspirational to me is Vin Martens, who's a classical composer. Do you know him, Jenny? Like, is he really well known? I'm using you as my barometer because you're very clever.
He did a Peter Greenaway. Did he do a Peter Greenaway? Have I made that up?
Oh my God, you're so good. Yeah, he did Belly of an Architect. But I think that was it. But it was pre-composed music. He didn't write the score for it.
Right.
Someone who, when I talk about his work, I'm a massive fan. No one's ever really heard of him. So I think that's someone really interesting to listen to. Just curry catnip. It's sad, lyrical, melancholy, epic, beautiful, soulful music. And the person that I'm listening to absolutely loads through lockdown is Chipsel, who's a video game composer. She is just absolutely fantastic, well known within the video game community, but for those people, if people that aren't working in games, maybe not so well known. And her music is just uplifting, energetic, fun, young, everything I don't feel at the moment. Chipsel is providing like an adrenaline Pulp Fiction shot to my heart. I can't recommend her music enough. It's just her. I interviewed her for Sound of Gaming, which was the radio show I did on video game music, and she is her music. She's kind of funny and lively and kind of crazy and wonderful. Great person to follow on Twitter as well, if you want to know about video game composition, because she's actually very good about talking about what she's up to. And that's a tip in general, I would say, actually, because I get asked a lot again for like, how do I get into the industry and things. I think a lot of people, Lena Rain's the same, really interesting about her process of how to write for video games. And I think that's the other thing that you can do if you're starting out, is just follow those big composers. Austin Wintory, Jason Graves has just done a fantastic interview. So get into that community with the big guns and find out what they're up to, because they're very generous about sharing their process, actually.
Great, thank you. There are some great questions. Thank you, everyone. Do keep them coming in. And I hope, Jess, are you all right to answer a couple more?
Yes, no, I'm good. I'm ready.
Oh, good. Okay, this is from Ian Dollamore. How involved are you with the sound design? And is this a critical skill for a games composer?
That's a really good question. For me, when I was at film school, I'm going way back now, but when I started at film school, a really influential sound installation artist came in called Evelyn Ficara, and she just blew my mind. She was just so experimental and interesting and creative. And for me, since then, on any project that I do, there has never been any difference between sound design and music. For me, they're so intertwined. And I think that's why the Rapture music, like, it won Best BAFTA for audio as well, because we worked so closely together. You often couldn't tell what was music and what was sound design, because we just bled those two worlds so seamlessly together. And that was something that we literally worked for years on. So if you want to be a video game composer, make the audio designer on any project your new best mate, buy them a pint or a cup of coffee, because you can tell when there hasn't been a relationship, I think. And it's one of my massive bugbears in telly and film as well, where I think these two people never met, they never talked, they were never allowed to listen to each other's work. And there's just when that difference of intent comes, it's so dissonant and so unpleasant. So for me, it's one of the things I feel most passionately about. It's vital. I hope I've explained how vital I feel that is. Can everyone tell I haven't spoken to anyone for 6 months apart from my immediate family? So excited. Hysterical.
Okay, this is a really good one from James Cresswell, and this it's actually something that you and I spoke about beforehand, sort of advice that you'd give your younger self, and I think this kind of ties in nicely. He says, I can identify with what you mentioned about self-doubt and kind of wavering confidence that comes with being self-taught musically. And he says, as someone who's trying to stick his head out a bit more as a freelance composer, can you share any specific revelations that you've had that helps you to become more confident as a composer?
That's a really nice question. I think I worked with the then Poet Laureate Carol Ann Duffy a few years ago, I think it was 2016. And she was just so fiercely unapologetic, but she wasn't an arsehole. And I thought it was a fantastic combination.
That's a tough, I mean, that's a fine line.
It's a fine line, but she absolutely navigated it. She had such a quiet self-belief in her talent. And I thought, how blissful that must be to go, do you know what? I have something to say and I'm not afraid to know it and to put that out there, but also just be really humble and nice and interesting. And it was quite a difficult commission in some ways. And the way she dealt with one of the commissioners, I'm always apologizing. I'm the most English person ever. I'm always like, oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry I came. Sorry I'm early. Oh, sorry I've written the music. Oh, sort of Hugh Grant sort of mess of apology. And she was just herself. Again, it just came down to that kind of self-belief. And it just gave me I'm still working on it 4 years later, but a kernel of a possibility of a future where I could get to a point where I could say I'm okay at this. And it's really interesting because I've won so many awards. I know it sounds crazy, but I still think I'm a bit shit. I think at what point do you just go, well, I'm okay? And so it's difficult to give advice because I'm 47 and I'm still trying to learn to accept that I have a space in the creative industry. So yeah, if I had any advice, it'd just be don't waste as much time as I am still doing on, it's difficult because it's what makes vulnerability makes you human, makes you be able to create, but past a certain point it's not useful and it's time wasting. But I think surrounding yourself with people who are positive about your work and believe in you is really important. Actually finding those collaborators that feel you have something valuable to contribute.
And I mean, there is that argument that the minute you were to go, I'm great, everything I write is great, don't talk to me because this is going to be great, I don't even want to talk to you about what you want from the game because this is going to be like, that's surely that creativity, in a way. Unfortunately, Jess, I think you might always have to feel a little bit like you are shit because then it will make you want to do the very best you can.
That's it. I think that's what I do have, is a commitment to excellence, and it drives people nuts. I really understand. If I knew me, I would hate me because like when we were on Rapture, I was running the company as well as writing the music. It was a hugely busy time. And I was just like, this game is not going out until it is perfect. And I remember one of the junior artists had spent days making a daffodil to put in the game. And I was like, the game is set in June. There will be no daffodils. I was so awful. I was just like, it was so unlikable. But I was like, there will be nothing that takes you out of the reality, of the believability of this. And I think there are more talented people than me, but I think it requires lots of different strands to be successful, actually. And I think a commitment, that's why I only take on very few projects, because every project that I do, the commitment that I give to that person is I will do the very best for you. There will be nothing I haven't given to this project by the time it finishes. And that's how you make great things, as opposed to, yeah, it was all right things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's I mean, that's a very nice way of note to end on. I mean, just as a final question, any tips for new composers to sort of endear themselves to people taking a chance on them, really? I mean, you've talked about kind of following composers and kind of getting into that world, but just for people who, you know, whose CVs aren't yet that full and they need to make a great impression, what advice would you give?
Yeah, it's a really tough industry to get into. Dan's just put out an internship for people who are struggling to get into the industry, and he's been absolutely inundated. It's a really popular industry to get into, so I really empathize with people who are trying to get their voices heard. I think I get a lot of emails from people saying, I wrote to Sony and, you know, they just don't want, they haven't listened to my music. I'm like, you know, I as a composer get all these emails. I can't imagine how inundated people are. So it's probably not going to work. I'm not saying don't shoot for the stars. I'm also saying maybe the time you've spent sending the same 500, you know, same email 500 times could be one beautiful bespoke letter. And interesting, when I look over hiring when I was still at the Chinese Room as co-director, we were such a sucker for the letter that said, this is who I am as a person, this is what has touched me about your games, this is why I want to work for the Chinese Room. It's not about ego, it's about going, oh, that's a creative soul that I can connect with and that we'll be able to do something special together. So for me, it's about targeting. If you don't really want to write that kind of music, that will come through you will be found out in the end. So find out what it is you're passionate about, and then really hone down on finding those people that do that. And I think I've said earlier, but finding fellow early career people to make things weird, they're probably going to be the people who are running the industry in another 10, 15 years time. So it's just going to, I think there is a certain amount of impatience sometimes going, well, I've never written for a video game before, but I want to do the next God of War. And I'm like, happen. This is millions and millions and tens of millions of pounds entrusted in these games. They want to know you're a safe pair of hands. They want to know you're fun to work with, you know, because it's hard and arduous. That trust has to be earned. And your own games, if you want to, you know, it's something Lena Raine, who we were talking about before, is doing. She's going, well, this kind of game doesn't exist, so I'm going to make it and then write the music for it. So there's all kinds of punk DIY, you know, that kind of aesthetic is really appealing to me, where you go, you don't just wait for the opportunity, you make it and then make things and see how it flies. Try and get it out there. Be proactive, be confident, be punctual, and don't be an asshole.
Let's get that Caroline Duffy, really that fine line.
Attitude, like self-respect is really important, but also respecting the creative time of other experienced people really matters. And trying to learn from people. I would say listen to Lucy's show. Jenny will be too modest to talk about it, but there's a great weekly show on Scala, and Lucy's so knowledgeable, genuinely, and she's so passionate about it, and she plays such a range of music, and I think learning what's out there is really, really useful, and hearing what people are doing, where the zeitgeist is. I presented Sound of Gaming for Radio 3. I interview nearly every major video game composer on that, and they talk about how they got into the industry, what they're doing. They talk about techniques, so you can educate yourself that way as well. Through the medium of radio, Jennifer.
Well, that seems like the perfect way to end it then. I'm sorry this has gone on a little bit long, but thank you for your questions, and I apologise that we haven't been able to get through to all of them. But Jessica, this has been just such a lovely session. Thank you. I feel like there are a million more things we could ask about your process, but thank you for sharing, and thank you for wearing your heart on your sleeve, because that's what makes your music it's the emotions and the vulnerability that you share. So I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming and listening. I really appreciate it. Contact with the outside world. Thank you. Bye.